Chapter 1 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 1. Bonnie Dundee stretched out a long and rather fine pair of legs, regarding the pattern of his dark blue socks with distinct satisfaction. Then he rested his black head against the rich upholstery of an armchair not at all intended for his use. His cheerful blue eyes turned at last, but not too long a last, to the small upright figure seated at a typewriter desk in the corner of the office. "Good morning, Penny," he called out lazily, and good-humouredly waited for the storm to break. "Miss Crane, to you?" The flying fingers did not stop an instant, but Dundee noticed with glee that the slim back stiffened even more rigidly, and that there was a decided toss of the brown bobbed head. "But Penny is so much more like you," Dundee protested, unruffled. "And why should I be forced always to think of you as a long-legged bird, when even our mutual boss, District Attorney William S. Sanderson, has the privilege of calling you what you are, a bright and shining new penny?" "I've known Bill Sanderson since I was born," the unseen lips informed him truculently, even as the unseen fingers continued their fiercely staccato typing. "Ah, that explains a lot," Dundee conceded handsomely. "I just wondered, amidst all his bonhomie of Bill and Penny, why I only call Mr. Sanderson Bill when I forget," the small creature defended herself sharply. "Goodness knows I tried to be an efficient private secretary. And I could be a lot more efficient if lazy strangers didn't plump themselves down in our best visitor's chair and try to flirt with me. I don't flirt. Do you hear? I don't flirt with anybody." "Flirt with you, you funny little penny?" Dundee's voice was a little sad, the voice of a man who finds himself grievously misunderstood. "I only want you to like me, if you can, and be a little nice to me. For after all, Oh, I know!" Penny Crane jerked the finished letter from her typewriter and spun about on her narrow-backed swivel chair to face him. "I know you are Mr. James F. Dundee, Special Investigator, attached to the office of the District Attorney, and that you have a right to drive me crazy if you want to." "Crazy?" Dundee was genuinely amazed, contrite. "I beg your pardon most humbly, Miss Crane. I'll go back to my cell. Your office is almost as big and nice as this one," Penny retorted, but her sharp, bright brown eyes, really almost the color of a new penny, softened until they took on a velvety depth. Dundee did not fail to notice the softening, nor did the little heart-shaped face, with its low widow's peak, its straight, short nose and its pointed little chin, made almost childish by the deep cleft which cut through its obvious effort to look mature and determined, fail to please him any more acutely than on the other days of the one short week he had been privileged at intervals to gaze upon it. "But the files and other things are in this office," he told her, his blue eyes twinkling happily once more. "Don't you dare touch my files again!" Penny cried, springing to her feet and running toward the wall, which was completely concealed by drawers, cabinets and shelves, filled with the records of which she was the proud custodian. "That's why I said just now that you were driving me crazy. Thursday you took a whole folder of correspondence out of the letter files and put it back under the wrong initial. I had to hunt for it for 2 hours, with Mr. Sanderson, gnawing his nails with impatience. He thought I had filed it wrong, and you might have made me lose my job." Unconsciously her slightly husky contralto voice had sunk lower and trembled audibly. "I'm awfully sorry. I shan't touch your files again, Miss Crane." "Oh, go on and call me Penny," she conceded impatiently. "What do you want now?" And you can get anything you need out of the files, if you'll just put the folder in the bottom drawer of my desk, so that I can file it myself. Correctly." "Thank you, Penny," Bonnie Dundee said gravely. "I'd like awfully to have the complete transcript of The State versus McGinty. Mr. Sanderson is determined to get a conviction where our former district attorney most ingloriously failed. The new trial comes up in 2 weeks, and he wants me to try to uncover a missing link of evidence." "I know," she nodded, and stretched her short, slender body to pull down the 2 heavy volumes he required. Without a by your leave, Special Investigator Dundee resumed his comfortable seat and laid the first of the volumes open upon his knees. But he did not seem to take a great deal of interest in the impanelling of jurors in the case of one Rufus McGinty, who had won the temporary triumph of a hung jury under the handling of the state's case by District Attorney Sherwood, deposed in November's election. Rather, his eyes followed the small brisk figure of Miss Penelope Crane as it moved about the room, and his ears listened to the somewhat charming though emphatic tapping of her French heels. French heels! Hadn't she been wearing sensible Cuban-heeled Oxfords all other days of his first week of his attachment to the district attorney's office? Cunning little thing, for all her thorniness and her sharpness with him, which he now saw that he had deserved. Pretty, too. Damned pretty. What color was that dress of hers? Let's see. Chartreuse, didn't they call it? Chartreuse with big brown dots in it. Bet it was sleeveless under that short little jacket of golden brown chiffon velvet. By Jove! And Dundee lapsed into one of the Englishisms he had picked up during his 6 months' work in England as a tyro in the records department of Scotland Yard, before he had come to Hamilton to make a humble beginning as a cub detective on the homicide squad. Yes, by Jove, she was all dressed up, for some reason or other. Of course, because it's Saturday and you have the afternoon off. Dundee finished his reverie aloud, to the astonishment of the small person trying to reach a file drawer just a little too high for her. "I mean," he hastened to explain, "that I've just noticed how beautiful your costume is, and found a reason for it." There was sudden color in the creamy face. The French heels tapped an angry progress across the big office, and Penny sat down abruptly in her swivel chair, reached across the immaculate desk, snatched up a morning paper and tossed it, without a glance, in the general direction of her tormentor. "Page 3, column 2, first item," she informed him ungraciously, and then began to search with a funny sort of desperation for more work to consume her extraordinary energy. Bonnie Dundee grinned indulgently as he opened the Hamilton Morning News and turned to the specified page and column. "Ah, my old friend the society editress, in her very best style," he commented as he began to read aloud. "Mrs. Juanita Selim, new and charming member, is entertaining the Forsyte Alumni Bridge Club this afternoon. Luncheon to be served at the exclusive new Breakaway Inn on Sheridan Road." "I've read it, and I'm busy, so shut up," Penny commanded as she gathered up pencils to sharpen. Quite meekly, Bonnie Dundee subsided into silent perusal of an item he was sure could have no possible interest for himself, in either a personal or professional capacity, unless Penny's name was in it somewhere. After which the jolly party of young matrons and maids will adjourn to Mrs. Selim's delightful home in the Primrose Meadows edition. He chuckled and dared to interrupt the high importance of pointing up pencils. "I say, that's funny, isn't it? Primrose Meadows edition." "I don't think it's funny," Penny retorted coldly. "It so happens that my mother named it, that my father went into bankruptcy trying to make a go of it, and that Mrs. Selim's delightful home was built to be our home, and in which we were fortunate enough to live only 2 months before the crash came." "Oh," Dundee groaned. Penny, I'm dreadfully sorry." "Shut up," she ordered, but her voice was huskier than ever with tears. Dundee's now thoroughly interested eyes raced down the absurdly written paragraphs. Although not an alumna of that famous and select school for girls, Forsyte-on-the-Hudson, graduation from which places any Hamilton girl in the very inner circle of Hamilton society, Mrs. Selim has been closely identified with the school, having for the past 2 years directed and staged Forsyte's annual play, which ushers in the Easter vacation. Indeed, it was Mrs. Selim's remarkable success with this year's play which caused Mrs. Peter Dunlap, long interested in a little theatre for Hamilton, to induce the beautiful and charming young directress to come to Hamilton with her. Plans for the little theatre are growing apace, and it is safe to conjecture that not all the conversation flying thick and fast about Nita's bridge tables this afternoon will be concerned with contract conventions, scores and finesses which failed. Lovely Nita was elected to membership a fortnight ago, when a vacancy occurred due to the resignation of Miss Alice Humphrey, who has gone abroad for a year's study in the Sorbonne. The two-table club now includes Mesdames Hugo Marshall, Tracy A. Miles, Peter Dunlap, John C. Drake, Juanita Selim, and Mrs. Polly Beale, Janet Raymond, and Penelope Crane. Dundee lowered the paper and stared at the profile of District Attorney Sanderson's private secretary. So she was a society girl, a Forsyte girl. Was that the reason, perhaps, why she had been so thorny with him, a mere dick? Well, he wasn't just a dick any longer. He was a special investigator, a society girl playing at work. But there was more, and he read on. As is well known, the girls have their hen fight bridge luncheon every Saturday afternoon from the 1st of October to the 1st of June, and a bridge dinner, in which mere men are graciously included, every other Wednesday evening during the season. Mr. and Mrs. Tracy A. Miles are scheduled as next Wednesday's host and hostess. "I'll take off my hat to your society editress," Dundee commented with false cheerfulness, when he had laid the paper back upon Penny's desk. "She makes half a column of this one item in what must be a meagre Saturday bunch of society notes, then writes it all over again in the past tense for an equally meagre Monday column. Like bridge, Miss Crane?" Penny snatched up the paper and crushed it into her wastebasket. "I do. And I like my old friends, even if I am not able financially to keep up with them. If that's why you've suddenly decided to stop being comrades." "Please forgive me again, Penny," he begged gently. "I was born into that crowd, and I still belong to it, because all of them are my real friends, but get this into your thick Scotch-Irish head, Mr. Dundee, I'm working because I have to, and because I love it, too, and because I want to earn enough before I'm many years older to give Mother some of the things she's missing so dreadfully since my father failed and ran away." "Ran away?" Dundee echoed incredulously. How could any man desert a daughter like this? "Yes, ran away," she repeated fiercely. "I might as well tell you myself. Plenty of others will be willing to, as soon as they know you are my friend. As I told you, my father—" Her voice broke. "My father went bankrupt, but before the courts knew it, he had sent some securities to a woman in New York, and when he left us, he went to her, because he left Mother a note saying so. His defrauded creditors have tried to catch him, but they haven't yet." Very gently Bonnie Dundee took the small hand that was distractedly rumpling the brown waves which swept back from the Widow's Peak. It lay fluttering in his bigger palm for a moment, then snatched itself away. "I won't have you feeling sorry for me," she cried angrily. "Who owns the Primrose Meadows house now? Mrs. Selim?" he asked. "The lovely Nita?" Her voice was scornful. "No. She rents it from Judge Hugo Marshall, or is supposed to pay him rent," she added with a trace of malice. "Hugo is an old darling, but he is fearfully weak where pretty women are concerned. Nita Selim had known Hugo in New York. somehow, and as soon as Lois, Mrs. Dunlap, I mean, had got Nita off the train, the stranger in our midst hied herself to Hugo's office, and he's been tagging after her ever since, though most of the men in our crowd are as bad as or worse than poor old Hugo. How Karen keeps on looking so blissfully happy—" "Karen?" Dundee interrupted. "Mrs. Hugo Marshall," she explained impatiently. "Karen Plummer made her debut a year ago, this last winter, a darling of a girl. Judge Marshall, retired judge, you know, had been proposing to the prettiest girl in each season's crop of Debs for the last 20 years, and Hugo must have been the most nonplussed perennial bachelor who ever led a grand march when Karen snapped him up. Loved him, actually. And it seems to have worked out marvelously. A baby boy, 3 months old," she concluded in her laconic style. Then, ashamed, "I don't know why I'm gossiping like this." "Because you can't find another blessed scrap of work to do, you little efficiency fiend." Dundee laughed. "Come on, gossip some more. My Maginty case will wait till afternoon, to be mulled over while you're losing your hard-earned salary at bridge with rich women." "We don't play for high stakes," she corrected him. "Just a 20th of a cent a point, though contract can run into money even at that. The winnings all go to the Forsyte Scholarship Fund. On Wednesday evenings the crowd plays for higher stakes, a 10th, and winners keepers. Therefore I can't afford to go, unless I sink so low as to let my escort pay my losses, which I sometimes do," she confessed, her brown head low for a moment. "Is this Mrs. Peter Dunlap a deep-bosomed club woman who starts movements?" he asked, more to bring her out of her depression than anything else. "Bigger and better babies movements, and homes for fallen girls, and little theater movements?" The brown head flung itself up sharply, and the brown eyes hardened into bright pennies again. "Lois Dunlap is the sweetest, finest, most comfortable woman in Hamilton, and I adore her. As does everyone else, Peter Dunlap hardly more than the rest of us. She is interested in a little theater for Hamilton, but she won't manage it. That's why she got hold of Nita Selim. Lois will simply put up barrels of money, without missing them, and give a grand job to a little Broadway gold digger. Funny thing is, she really delights in Nita, thinks she's sweet, and has never had a real chance." "And what do you think?" Dundee asked softly. "Oh, I suppose I'm a cat, but I can see through her so clearly. Not that she's bad, she's simply an opportunist. She's awfully sweet and deferential and frank with women, but with men, well, she simply tucks her head so that her shoulder-length black curls fall forward enchantingly, gives them one wistful smile out of her big eyes that are like black pansies, and the clink of slave chains. Now go on and think I'm catty, which I suppose I am." Bonnie Dundee grinned at her reassuringly. Not for him to explain that practically all women and many men found themselves gossiping when he led them on adroitly, for reasons of his own. Which of course helped him to make the excellent detective he was. "So all the men in your crowd have fallen for Nita Selim, have they?" "Practically all, in varying degrees, except Peter Dunlap, who has never looked at another woman since he was lucky enough to get Lois, and Clive Hammond, who's engaged to Polly Beale," Penny answered reluctantly, her color high. "Including your young man?" "I haven't a young man in the sense of being engaged," Penny retorted, then added honestly, "I have been letting Ralph Hammond, that's Clive's brother, you know, take me about a good deal. Ralph and Clive have plenty of money," she defended herself hastily. "They are architects, Clive being the head of the firm, and Ralph, who hasn't been out of college so very long, a junior partner. It was the Hammond firm that drew up the plans for my father's, Primrose Meadows Edition houses. He had our house built as a sort of show place, you know, so that prospective builders out there could see how artistic a home could be put up for a moderate sum of money. But he didn't quite finish even that. Left half the gabled top story unfinished, and Nita has been teasing Hugo to finish it up for her. It looks," she added with a shrug, "as if Nita will get what she wants. As usual." "And Ralph has acquired a set of slave chains?" Dundee suggested, with just the slightest note of sympathy. "And how?" Penny assured him grimly. "A simile as out of date as my clothes are going to be if I don't get some new ones soon. Not that the crowd minds what I wear," she added loyally. "I could dress up in a window drape. And be just as charming as you are in that grand new party dress you have on now," Dundee finished for her gallantly. "New!" Penny snorted and turned back to her desk in a futile effort to find something left undone. Dundee ignored the rebuff. How many how many gentlemen with moderate incomes actually built in Primrose Meadows? "You are inquisitive, aren't you?" "None. Our house, or rather the one Nita Selim is living in now, is the only house on what used to be a big farm. Why?" "I was just wondering," Dundee said softly, almost absent-mindedly, "why the lovely Nita chose so isolated a place in which to live, when Hamilton has rather a large number of 'For Rent' signs out just now. By the way, know what time it is now? 20 to 1. Get your hat on, young woman. I'm going to drive you out to Breakaway Inn." "You're not. I'm going to take a bus. One runs from the square right past the inn," she told him firmly. And just as firmly Dundee escorted her out of the almost deserted, rather dirty old courthouse to where his brand new sports roadster, bought "on time," was awaiting them in the parking space devoted to the motors of those who officially served Hamilton County. "I know why you want to drive me out to the inn," Penny told him suddenly, as the proud owner maneuvered his car through Saturday noon traffic. "You want to see Nita Selim. Clank, clank. I can hear the padlocks snapping in the slave chains right now." "Meow," Dundee retorted, then grinned down at her with as much comradely affection as if they had been friends for years instead of for a couple of hours. "Is Nita very small?" he added. "Little enough to tuck herself under the arm of a man a lot shorter than you," Penny assured him with curious vehemence. "And if Penelope Crain is no mean prophet, that's exactly what she'll do within 5 minutes after she meets you, just as she is wistfully inviting you to join the other men for the cocktail party which is scheduled to break up the bridge game at 5:30. Then, of course, you'll be urged to join us all at the dinner dance at the country club tonight." "Will she?" Dundee pretended to be vastly intrigued, which caused the remainder of the drive to be a rather silent one, due to Penny's unresponsiveness. Breakaway Inn was intensely Spanish in architecture and transplanted shrubbery, but its stucco walls were of a rather more violent raspberry color than is considered quite aesthetic in Spain or Mexico. "There's Lois Dunlap's car just driving up," Penny cried, her face softening with the adoration she had freely professed for her friend. But it clouded again almost instantly. "And Nita Selim. I suppose Nita was a little ashamed to drive up in her own Ford coupe." As Dundee helped his new friend to alight, his eyes were upon the two women being assisted by a uniformed chauffeur from Lois Dunlap's limousine. In a moment the four were a laughing exclamatory group. "Oh, what a tall, grand man you've got yourself, Penny darling!" The tiny, beautiful creature who could only be Mrs. Selim cried out happily. "May I meet him?" "I shouldn't let you," Penny answered frankly, "but I will. Mrs. Selim, Mr. Dundee, and Mrs. Dunlap, Mr. Dundee. How are you, Lois? And Peter and the brats?" "All well, Penny. Peter is off on a weekend fishing trip, and not one of the brats has measles, scarlet fever, or hay fever, thank God," Dundee heard Mrs. Dunlap say in the comfortable, affectionate voice that went with her comfortable, pleasant face and body. Nice woman. But his eyes were of necessity upon Nita Selim, for that miniature Venus was, as Penny had predicted, almost tucked under his arm by this time, her black pansy eyes wide and wistful, her soft black curls falling forward as she coaxed. "You'll come to the cocktail party at my house at 5:30, won't you, Mr. Dundee?" "Afraid I can't make it." Dundee smiled down at her. "I'm a busy man, Mrs. Selim. You see, I'm special investigator attached to the district attorney's office," he explained very deliberately. Oh, Nita Selim breathed. Then, step by step, she withdrew, so that he was no longer submitted to the temptation to put his arm about her too intriguing little body. And as she retreated, Dundee's keen eyes noted a hardening of the black pansy eyes, the sudden throbbing of a pulse in her very white neck. "No, don't mind about calling for me," Penny protested a moment later. "Rolf has already volunteered. Thanks awfully." As Dundee backed out of the driveway, his last glance was for a very small figure in a brown silk summer coat and palest yellow chiffon frock, slowly rejoining Penelope Crain and Lois Dunlap. What the devil had frightened her so? For she had been almost terrified. Of course she might be one of those silly women who shudder at the sight of a detective because they've smuggled in a diamond from Paris or a bottle of Bacardi from Havana. But long before his car made the distance back to the city, Dundee had shrugged off the riddle and was concentrating on all the facts he knew regarding the Maginty case. It was his first real assignment from Sanderson, and he was determined to make good. 4 hours later he was interrupted in his careful reading of the trial of Rufus Maginty by the ringing of the telephone bell. That made 4 times he had to snap out the fact that District Attorney Sanderson was playing some well-earned golf on the country club links, Dundee reflected angrily as he picked up the receiver. But the call was for Dundee himself, and the voice on the other end of the wire was Penny Crain's, although almost unrecognizable. "Speak more slowly, Penny," Dundee urged. "What's that again? Good Lord! You say that Nita Selim—" After a minute of listening, and a promise of instant obedience, Dundee hung up the receiver. "My God," he said slowly, blankly. "Of all things, murder at bridge!" End of chapter 1. Recorded by Gesine in September 2007.
Of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen, Chapter 2. As Special Investigator Dundee drove through the city of Hamilton at a speed of 60 miles an hour, his way being cleared by traffic policemen, warned by the shrill official siren which served him as a horn, he had little time to think connectedly of the fact that Nita Selim had been murdered during a bridge game in her rented home in Primrose Meadows. Even after the broad sleekness of Sheridan Road stretched before him, he could do little more than to realize the shock which had numbed him. Lovely Nita, as the society editor of the Morning News had called her, was dead. How? Why? He did not know. He had asked no details of Penny Crain. Funny, thorny little Penny. Loyal little Penny. Judge Marshall had telephoned police headquarters, she had told him breathlessly over the telephone. But I made him let me call you as soon as he had hung up. I wanted our office to be in on this right from the first. Beautiful, seductive Nita Selim almost cuddling under his arms within 3 minutes of meeting him, dead. A vision of her black pansy eyes, so wide and luminous and wistful as they had looked sideways and upward to his, pleading for him to join her after bridge cocktail party, nearly made him crash into a lumbering furniture van. Those eyes were luminous no longer, could never again snap the padlocks of slave chains upon any man, as Penny had expressed it. Dead. And she had been so warmly alive, even as she had retreated from him at his mention of the fact that he was attached to the office of the district attorney as a special investigator. What had she feared then? Was her death a payment for some recent or long-standing crime? Or had she simply been withdrawing from contamination with a flat foot? No, she had been afraid, horribly afraid, of some ulterior purpose behind his innocent courtesy in driving Penelope Crain to Breakaway Inn. Well, speculation now was idle, he told himself, as he noted that his speedometer had dropped from 60 to 30 in his preoccupation. He speeded again, but was soon forced to stop and ask his way into Primrose Meadows. The vague directions of a farmer's son lost him nearly 8 precious minutes, during which his friend, Captain Strawn of the Homicide Squad, might be bungling things rather badly. But at last he found the ornate pair of pillars spanned by the painted legend, Primrose Meadows, and drove through them into what soon became a rutted lane. Almost a quarter of a mile from the entrance he found the isolated house, unmistakable because of the line-up of private cars parked before the short stretch of paved sidewalk, and the added presence of police cars and motorcycles. Dundee turned his own car into the driveway leading from the street along the right side of the house towards the 2-car garage in the rear. Ahead of his roadster were 2 other cars, and a glance toward the open garage showed that a Ford coupe was housed there. As he was descending, Captain Strawn's voice hailed him from an open window of the room nearest the garage. "Hello, Bonnie. Been expecting you. Damnedest business you ever saw. There's a door from this room onto the porch. Hop up and come in." Dundee obeyed. Driving in, he had noted that a wide porch, upheld by round white pillars, stretched across the front of the gabled brick house and extended halfway along its right side, past a room which was obviously a solarium, with its continuous windows, gay awnings, and, visible through the glittering panes, orange and black wicker furniture. It was easy to swing himself up to the floor of the porch. Strawn flung open the door which led into the back room, remarking with a grin: "Don't be afraid I'm gumming up any fingerprints. Carraway has already been over the room. The Selim woman's bedroom," he explained. "The room she was killed in." "You have been on the job," Dundee complimented his former chief. "Sure," Strawn acknowledged proudly. "Can't be too quick on our stumps when it's one of these high society murders. Dr. Price will be here any minute now, and my men have been all over the premises, basement to attic. Of course, it was an outside job, plain as the nose on your face, and we haven't found a trace of the murderer." Although Mrs. Selim had taken the house furnished, it was obvious that this big bedroom of hers was not exactly as the Crain family had left it. A little too pretty, a little too aggressively feminine, with its chaise lounge heaped with silk and lace pillows, its superfluity of big and little lamps, its bed draped with golden yellow taffeta, its dressing table. But he could not let critical eyes linger on the triple mirrored vanity dresser, for on the bench before it sat a tiny figure, the head bowed so low that some of the black curls had fallen into a large open bowl of powder. She was no longer wearing the brown silk summer coat whose open front had given him a glimpse of pale yellow chiffon. He saw the dress now, a low-cut, sleeveless, fluffy affair, but he really had eyes only for the brownish red hole on the left side of the back of the bodice, about halfway between shoulder and waist, a waist so small he could have spanned it with his 2 hands, including its band of fuchsia velvet ribbon. There also had been a bow of fuchsia velvet ribbon on the lace and straw hat she had swung so charmingly less than 5 hours ago. "Shot through the heart, I guess," Strawn commented. "Took a good marksman to find her heart, shooting her through the back. Funny thing, too. Nobody heard the shot. Leastways, none of the crowd penned up in the living room will admit they did. They'll all hang together and lie like 60 to keep us from finding out anything that might point to one of their precious bunch. But if a gun with a Maxim silencer was used, as it must have been if that whole crew ain't lying, then the gunman must have been good, because you can't sight with a Maxim screwed onto a rod, you know." "Have your men found the gun?" Dundee asked. "Of course not, or I'd know whether it had been a Maxim on it or not," Strawn retorted. "My theory is," he added impressively, "that somebody with a grudge against this dame hired a gunman to hang around till he got her dead to rights, then plop!" And he imitated the soft, thudding sound made by the discharge of a bullet from a gun equipped with a silencer. "Doesn't it seem rather strange that a professional gunman should have chosen such a time, with men arriving in cars, and the house full of women who might wander into this room at any minute, to bump off his victim?" Dundee asked. "Well, there ain't no explanation," Captain Strawn contended, "outside of the fact that my men have gone over the whole house and grounds without finding the gun. I've got other evidence it was an outside job. Look." Dundee followed the Chief of Homicide's squad to one of the two windows that looked out upon the driveway. Both were open, since the May day was exceptionally warm, even for the Middle West. The unscreened window from which he obediently leaned was almost directly in line with the vanity dressing table across the room. "Look, see how them vines have been torn?" Strawn directed, pointing to a rambler rose which hugged the outside frame of the window. "And look hard enough at the flower bed down below and you'll see his footprints. Of course, we've measured them, and Cain, as you see, is guarding them till my man comes to make plaster casts of them. Yes, sir, he hoisted himself up to the window ledge, aimed as best he could, then slipped down and beat it across the meadow. Then," Dundee began slowly, "I wonder why this Mrs. Selim didn't see that figure crouched in the window, since she must have been powdering her face and looking into the middle of the three mirrors, the one which reflects this very window?" "How do you know she was powdering her face, not looking for something in a drawer?" Strawn demanded truculently. "For three reasons," Dundee answered almost apologetically. "First, her powder puff, as I am sure you notice, is still clutched in her right hand. Second, there is no drawer open, and no drawer was open, unless someone has closed it since the murder, whereas, on the other hand, her powder box is open. Third, the left side of her face is unevenly coated with the powder, while the other is heavily but evenly powdered. Therefore I can't see why she didn't scream, or turn round, when she heard your gunman clambering up to her window, or even when he had crouched in it. I don't see how she could help seeing him." "Well, what do you think?" Strawn asked sourly, after he had tested the visibility of the window from the dressing table mirror. "I'm afraid, Captain Strawn, that there are only two explanations possible. The first, of course, is that Nita Selim was quite deaf or very near-sighted. I happen to know from having met her today." "You met her today?" Strawn interrupted incredulously. Dundee explained briefly, then went on. "As I was saying, I have good reason to know she was not deaf, but I can't say as to her being near-sighted, except that it is my observation that people who are extremely near-sighted do not have very wide eyes and no creases in the brows. I am fairly sure she did not wear glasses at all, because glasses worn every few hours a day leave a mark across the nose or show pinched red spots on each side of the bridge of the nose." "You must have had a good hard look at her," Strawn gibed, his eyes twinkling, and his harsh, thin-lipped mouth pulling down at one corner in what he thought was a genial smile. "I did," Dundee retorted. "Well, conceding that she was neither deaf nor half blind, she would necessarily have heard and seen her assailant before he shot her." "What's the other explanation?" Strawn was becoming impatient. "That the person who killed her was so well known to her, and his or her presence in this room so natural a thing that she paid no attention to his or her movements, and was concentrating on the job of powdering her pretty face." "You mean one of that gang of society folks in there?" And Strawn jerked a thumb towards the left side of the house. "Very probably," Dundee agreed. "But where's the gun?" Strawn argued. "I tell you, my men " "This was a premeditated murder, of course," Dundee interrupted. "The Maxim silencer, unless they are all lying about not hearing a shot, proves that. Silencers are damned hard to get hold of, but people with plenty of money can manage most things. And since murder was premeditated, it is better to count on the fact that the murderer, or murderess, had planned a pretty safe hiding place for the gun and the silencer. "Oh, not necessarily in the house, nor even near the house," he hastened to assure Strawn, who was trying to break in. "By the way, how long after Mrs. Selim was killed was her death discovered? Or do you know?" "I haven't been able to get much out of that bunch in there, not even out of Penelope Crain, who ought to be willing to help, seeing as how she works for the district attorney. But I guess she's waiting to spill it all to you, if she knows anything, so you and Sanderson will get all the credit." "Now look here, Chief," Dundee protested, laying a hand on Strawn's shoulder as he reverted to the name by which he had addressed the head of the Homicide Squad for nearly a year. "We're going to be friends, aren't we? Same as always. We know pretty well how to work together, don't we? No use to begin pulling against each other." "Guess so," Strawn growled, but he was obviously pleased and relieved. "Maybe you'd better have a crack at that crowd yourself. I hear Doc Price's car always has a bum spark plug. I'll stick around with him until he gets going good on his job. Then, if you'll excuse me for butting in, I'll join your party in the living room. And good luck to you, Bonnie." Dundee took the door he knew must lead into the central hall, but found himself in an enclosed section of it, a small foyer between the main hall and Nita Selim's bedroom. There was room for a telephone table and its chair, as well as for a small sofa, large enough for two to sit upon comfortably. He paused to open the door across from the telephone table, and found that it opened into a closet, whose hangers and hat forms now held the outdoor clothing belonging to Nita's guests. Nice clothes, the smart but unostentatious hats and coats of moneyed people of good taste, he observed a little enviously, before he opened the door which led into the main hall, which bisected the main floor of the house until it reached Nita's room. Another door in the section behind the staircase leading to the gabled second story next claimed his attention. Opening it, he discovered a beautifully fitted guest's lavatory. There was even a fully appointed dressing table for women's use, so that none of her guests had had the slightest excuse to invade the privacy of Mrs. Selim's bedroom and bath, unless specifically invited to do so. Rather a well-planned house, this, Dundee concluded, as he closed the door upon the green porcelain fixtures, and walked slowly toward the wide archway that led from the hall into the large living room. He had a curious reluctance to intrude upon that assembled and guarded company of Hamilton's real society. They were all Penny's friends, and Penny was his friend. But his first swift, all-seeing glance about the room reassured him. No hysterics here. These people brought race and breeding even into the presence of death. Whatever emotions had torn them when Nita Selim's body was discovered were almost unguessable now. A stout, short woman of about 30 was tapping a foot nervously as she talked to the man who was bending over her chair. John C. Drake, that was. Dundee had met him, knew him to be a vice president of the Hamilton National Bank, in charge of the trust department. Penelope Crain was occupying half of a love seat with Lois Dunlap, the hands of the girl and of the woman clinging together for mutual comfort. That tall, thin, oldish man with the waxed gray mustache must be Judge Hugo Marshall, and the pretty girl leaning trustingly against his shoulder must be his wife, Karen Marshall, who had jumped at her first proposal during her first season. "Yes, well-bred people," he concluded, as his eyes swept on, and then stopped, a little bewildered. Who was that man? He didn't belong somehow, and his hands trembled visibly as he tried to light a cigarette. Leaning, not nonchalantly, but actually for support, against the brocaded, coral silk drapes of a pair of wide, long windows set in the east wall. Suddenly Dundee had it. Broadway! This was no Hamiltonian, no comfortably rich and socially secure Middle Westerner. Broadway, in every line of his too well-tailored clothes, in the polished smoothness of his dark hair. "Why, it's Mr. Dundee at last!" Penny cried, turning in the S-shaped seat before he had time to finish his mental inventory of the room's occupants. She jumped to her feet and threaded a swift way over Oriental rugs and between the two bridge tables still occupying the centre of the big room, still cluttered with score pads, tally cards, and playing cards. "I've been wondering if you had stopped to have dinner first," she taunted him. Then, laying a hand on his arm, she faced the living room eagerly. "This is Mr. Dundee, folks. Special investigator attached to the district attorney's office, and a grand detective. He solved the Hogarth murder case, you know, and the Hillcrest murder, and he's my friend, so I want you all to trust him, and tell him things without being afraid of him." Then, rather ceremoniously but swiftly, she presented her friends: Judge and Mrs. Hugo Marshall, Mr. and Mrs. Tracey Miles, Mr. and Mrs. John C. Drake, Mrs. Dunlap, Janet Raymond, Polly Beale, Clive Hammond, and... At that point Penny hesitated, then rather stiffly included the Broadway man as Mr. Dexter Sprague of New York. "Thank you, Miss Crain," Dundee said. "Now will you please tell me if you know whether all those invited to both the bridge party and the cocktail party are here?" Penny's face flamed. "Ralph Hammond, Clive's brother, hasn't come yet. I imagine I've been stood up," she confessed with a faint attempt at gaiety. And Ralph Hammond was the man who had once belonged rather exclusively to Penny, and who, according to her own confession, had succumbed most completely to Nita Selim's charms, Dundee noted, filing the reflection for further reference. "Please, Mr. Dundee, won't you detain us as short a time as possible?" Lois Dunlap asked as she advanced towards him. "Mr. Dunlap is away on a fishing trip, and I don't like to leave my 3 youngsters too long. They are really too much of a handful for the governess over a period of hours." "I shall detain all of you no longer than is absolutely necessary," Dundee told her gently. "But I am afraid I must warn you that I can't let you go home very soon, unless one or more of you has something of vital importance to tell. Something which will clear up or materially help to clear up this bad business." He paused a long half minute, then asked curtly: "I am to conclude that no one has anything at all to volunteer?" There was no answer, other than a barely perceptible drawing together in self-defense of the minds and hearts of those who had been friends for so long. "Very well," Dundee conceded abruptly. "Then I must put all of you through a routine examination, since every one of you is of course a possible suspect." End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 3. "Goodbye dinner," groaned the plump blond little man who had been introduced as Tracey Miles, as he sorrowfully patted his rather prominent stomach. "Don't worry, darling," begged the dark, neurotic-looking woman who was Flora Miles, his wife. "I'm sure Mr. Dundee will ask Lydia, poor Nita's maid, you know," she explained in an aside to Dundee, "to prepare a light supper for us if he really needs to detain us long, which I am sure he won't." "How can you think of food now?" Polly Beale, the tall, sturdy girl with an almost masculine bob and a quite masculine tweed suit, demanded brusquely. Her voice had an unfeminine lack of modulation, but when Dundee saw her glance toward Clive Hammond, he realized that she was wholly feminine where he was concerned, at least. "Of course we are all dreadfully cut up over poor Nita's death," gasped a rather pretty girl, whose most distinguishing feature was her crop of crinkly light red hair. "I assume that to be true, Miss Raymond," Dundee answered. "But we must lose no more time getting at the facts. Just when was Mrs. Selim murdered?" At the brutal use of the word a shudder rippled over the small crowd. Dexter Sprague, of New York, dropped his lighted cigarette where it would have burned a hole in a fine Persian rug if Sergeant Turner, on guard over the room for Captain Strawn, had not slouched from his corner to plant a big foot upon it. "We don't know exactly when it happened," Penny volunteered. "We were playing bridge, the last hand of the last rubber, because the men were arriving for cocktails, when Nita became dummy and went up to her bedroom to To make herself pretty for the men, Mrs. Drake mimicked. Then, realizing the possible effect of her cattiness on Dundee, she defended herself volubly. Of course, I liked Nita, but she did think so terribly about her effect on men, and all that, and was always fixing her makeup, and besides, you can't suspect me, because I was playing against Karen and Nita. Thank you, Mrs. Drake, Dundee cut in. Does anyone know the exact time Mrs. Selim left the room when she became dummy? I can tell you because I had just arrived, the first of the men to get here, Tracey Miles volunteered, obviously glad of the chance to talk, a characteristic of the man, Dundee decided. I looked at my watch just after I stepped out of my car, because I like to be on time to the dot, and Nita, Mrs. Selim, had said 5:30. Well, it was exactly 5:25, so I had 5 minutes to spare. Yes? Dundee speeded him up impatiently. Well, I came into the hall and hung my hat in the closet out there, and then came in here. It must have been about 5:27 by that time, he explained, with the meticulousness of a man on the witness stand. I shouted, "Hello, everybody! How's tricks?" That's a joke, you know. How's tricks? Meaning tricks and bridge. Yes, Dundee admitted, frowning, but the rest of the company exchanged indulgent smiles, and Flora Miles patted her husband's hand fondly. Well, Nita jumped up from the bridge table, that one right there. Miles pointed to the table nearer the arched doorway, and she said, "Good heavens, is it 5:30 already? I've got to run and make myself pretty for just such great big men as you, Tracey." "Tracey, darling," Judge Marshall corrected, with a chuckle that sounded odd in the tensely silent room. Tracey Miles flushed a salmon pink, and his wife's fingers clutched at his hand warningly. "Oh, Nita called everybody darling, and didn't mean anything by it, I guess," he explained uneasily. "Just one of her cute little ways. Well, anyway, she came up to me and straightened my necktie. Another one of her funny little ways, and said, 'Tracey, my own lamb, won't you shake up cocktails for poor little Nita?' You know, a sort of way she had of coaxing people." "Yes, I know," Dundee agreed, with a trace of a grin. "Go on as rapidly as you can, please." "I thought you wanted to know everything." Miles was a little peevish. He had evidently been enjoying himself. "Of course, I said I'd make the cocktails. She said everything was ready on the sideboard. That's the dining room right behind this room," he explained unnecessarily, since the French doors were open. "Well, Nita blew me a kiss from her fingertips and ran out of the room. Now, let's see," he ruminated, creasing his sunburned forehead beneath his carefully combed blonde hair. "That must have been at exactly 5:30 that she left the room. I went on into the dining room, and Mrs. Dunlap, came with me, because she said she was simply dying for a caviar sandwich and a nip of Scotch, Tracey," Lois Dunlap cut in, grinning. "I'm sure Mr. Dundee won't think I'm a confirmed tippler, so you might as well tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Poor Tracey has a deadly fear that we are all going to lose the last shred of our reputations in this deplorable affair, Mr. Dundee," she added, in a rather shaky version of the comfortable, rich voice he had heard earlier in the day. "I'm not going to pry into cellars," Dundee assured her in the same spirit. "What else, Mr. Miles?" "Nothing much," Tracey Miles confessed with apparent regret. "I was still mixing. No, I'd begun to shake the cocktails when I heard a scream." "Whose scream?" Dundee demanded, looking about the room and dismissing Miles thankfully. "It was I," Judge Marshall's fair-haired, blue-eyed little bride volunteered in a voice that threatened to rise to hysteria. "Tell me all about it," Dundee urged gently. "Yes, sir," she quavered, while her husband's arm encircled her shoulders in courtly fashion. "As Tracey told you, Nita was dummy and I was declarer. That is, I got the bid and played the hand. It was quite an exciting end for me to the afternoon of bridge, for I am not usually awfully lucky. So when Penny had figured up the score, because I'm not good at arithmetic, and I knew Nita and I had rolled up an awfully big score, I jumped up and ran into her room to tell her the good news, because she hadn't come back. And there she was, all bowed over her dressing table, and she was... "She was dead when you reached her?" Dundee assisted her. "Yes," Karen Marshall answered faintly, and turned to hide her face against her elderly husband's breast. Dundee's swift eyes took in the varying degrees of whiteness and sick horror that claimed every face in the room, as surely as if all present had not already heard Karen tell her story to Captain Strawn. Tracey Miles looked as if he would have no immediate craving for his dinner, and Judge Marshall's fine, thin face no longer looked so well preserved as he prided himself that it did. As for Dexter Sprague, he almost folded up against the coral brocade draperies. It was the women, oddly enough, who kept the better control over their emotions. "Of course you all rushed in when Mrs. Marshall screamed?" he asked casually. 12 heads nodded mutely. "Did any or all of you touch the body or things in the room?" "Mr. Sprague touched her hair and lifted one of her hands," Penny contributed quietly. "But you know how it must have been. We can't any of us tell exactly every move we made, but there was some rushing about, the men, mostly, looking for whoever did it." "Mrs. Marshall, did you see anyone at all, in or near that room when you entered it?" The white-faced young wife lifted her head and looked at him dazedly with drowned blue eyes. "There wasn't anyone in that room, I know," she faltered. "It felt horrible, being in there with her, all alone." "But near the room? In the main hall or in the little foyer where the telephone is?" Dundee persisted. "I don't think so. I can't remember seeing anyone. Oh, Hugo!" And again she crouched against her husband, who soothed her with trembling hands that looked incongruously old against her childish fair hair and face. "Where were the rest of you? Exactly where, I mean?" Dundee demanded, conscious that Captain Strawn had entered the room and was standing slightly behind him. There was such a babble of answers, given and then hastily corrected, that Dundee broke in suddenly. "I want a connected story of the events leading up to the tragedy. And I want someone to tell it who hasn't lost his, or her, head at all." He looked about the company as if speculatively, but his mind was already made up. "Miss Crane, will you tell the story, beginning with the moment I left you and Mrs. Dunlap and Mrs. Selim today?" Penny nodded miserably and was about to begin. "Just a minute before you begin, Miss Crane," Dundee requested. "I'd like to make notes on your story," and he drew from a coat pocket a shorthand book, hastily filched from Penny's own tidy desk. "Yes," he answered the girl's frank stare of amazement. "I can write shorthand, of a sort, and pretty fast at that, though no other human being, I am afraid, could read it but myself. As for you folks," he addressed the uneasy, silent group of men and women in dead Nita's living room, "I shall ask you not to interrupt Miss Crane unless you are very sure that her memory is at fault." Penelope Crane was about to begin for the second time, when again Dundee interrupted. "Another half-second, please." On the first sheet of the new shorthand notebook, Dundee scribbled: "Suggest you try to locate Ralph Hammond immediately. Very much in love with Mrs. Selim. Invited to cocktail party. Did not show up." Tearing the sheet from the notebook, he passed it to Captain Strawn, who read it, frowning, and then nodded. "Doc Price has done all he can here," Strawn whispered huskily. "Wants to know if you'd like to speak to him before he takes the body to the morgue." "Certainly," Dundee answered as he grinned apologetically to the girl who was waiting, white-faced but patiently, to tell the story of the afternoon. Quickly suppressed shudders and low exclamations of horror followed him and the chief of the homicide squad from the room. "Well, Bonnie boy, we meet again, for the usual reason," old Doc Price greeted the district attorney's new special investigator. "Another shocking affair, that. A nice clean wound, one of the neatest jobs I ever saw. Shot entered the back and penetrated the heart. Very nicely calculated. If the bullet had struck a quarter of an inch higher, it might have been deflected by the—" "But the path of the bullet, Doctor," Dundee broke in. "Have you any calculations as to the place and distance at which the shot was fired?" "Roughly speaking, yes," the coroner answered. "The gun was fired at a distance, probably, of 10 or 15 feet. Perhaps closer, but I don't think so," he added meticulously. "As for the path of the bullet, I have fixed it, judging from the position of the body, which I am assured had not been moved before my arrival, as coming from a point somewhere along a straight line drawn from the wound, with the body upright, of course, to here." Dundee and Strawn followed the brisk little white-haired old doctor across the bedroom to a window opening upon the drive, the one nearest the door leading out upon the porch. "I've marked the end of the line here," Dr. Price went on, pointing to a faint pencil mark made upon the window frame. The pale green strip of woodwork near the chaise lounge which was set between the two windows. "I told you she was shot from the window," Strawn reminded Dundee triumphantly. "You see, Doc, it's my theory that the murderer climbed up to the sill of this window, which was open, as it is now, crouched in it, and shot her while she sat there powdering her face." "Not necessarily, Captain, not necessarily," Dr. Price deprecated. "I merely said that this pencil mark indicated the end of the line showing the path of the bullet. Certainly she was not shot through the frame of the window, but she might have been shot by anyone stationed just in front of it, or anywhere along the line up to, say, within 10 feet of the woman. Now, if that's all, Captain, I'll be getting this corpse into the morgue for an autopsy, and I'll send you both a copy of my findings." "Just a minute, Dr. Price," Dundee detained him. "How old would you say Mrs. Selim was?" The doctor pursed his wrinkled lips and considered for a moment, eyeing the body stretched upon the chaise lounge speculatively. "Well, between 30 and 34 years old," he answered finally. "Of course you understand that the estimate is unofficial, and must remain so until I have completed the autopsy." Dundee stared down at the upturned face of the dead woman with startled incredulity. Between 30 and 34 years old? That tiny, lovely? But she was not quite so lovely in death, in spite of the serenity it had brought to those once vivacious features. Peering more closely, he could see, without those luminous, wide eyes to center his attention, numerous fine lines on the waxen face, the slackness of a little pouch of soft flesh beneath her round chin, and occasional white hair among the shoulder-length dark curls. Dundee sighed. How easy it was for a beautiful woman to deceive men with a pair of wide, velvety black eyes. But he'd bet the women had not been quite so thoroughly taken in by her cuddly childishness, her odd mixture of demureness and youthful impudence. Back in the living room, whose occupants stopped whispering and grew taut with suspense, Dundee seated himself at the little red lacquer table, notebook spread, while Strawn settled himself heavily in the nearest overstuffed armchair. "Now, Miss Crane, I am quite ready, if you will forgive me for having kept you waiting." In a very quiet voice, slightly husky as always, Penny began her story. "I think it lacked 2 or 3 minutes of 1 o'clock when you drove away. Nita, Lois, do you mind if I use the names I am most accustomed to? Thank you. And I went immediately into the lounge of Breakaway Inn, where we found Carol Drake and Flora Miles waiting for us. Nita soon left us to see about the arrangement of the table, and while she was away the rest of the girls arrived." "Except," a woman's voice broke in. "I was going to say, all 8 of us were ready for lunch except Polly Beale. She hadn't come," Penny went on, her husky voice a little sharp with annoyance. "When Nita came to ask us into the private dining room, one of the inn's employees came and told her there was a call for her, and showed her to the private booth in the lounge. In a minute Nita returned and told us that Polly wasn't coming to the luncheon, but would join us later for bridge here." "Why don't you tell him how funny Nita acted?" Janet Raymond prompted. Penny flushed, but she accepted the prompting. "I think any of us might have been a little annoyed," she said steadily, as if striving to be utterly truthful. "Nita told us," she turned to Dundee, whose pencil was flying, "that Polly had made no excuse at all. In fact, she quoted Polly exactly. 'Sorry, Nita, can't make it for lunch. I'll show up at your place at 2:30 for bridge.'" "Nita couldn't bear the least hint of being slighted," Janet Raymond explained, with a malicious gleam in her pale blue eyes. "If it hadn't been for Lois and Hugo, Judge Marshall, I mean, Nita Selim would never have been included in any of our affairs, and she knew it. The Dunlaps can do anything they please because they're—" "Please, Janet," Lois Dunlap cut in, her usually placid voice becoming quite sharp. "You must know by this time that I make friends wherever I please, and that I liked, yes, I was extremely fond of poor little Nita. In fact, I am forced to believe that, of all the women she met in this town, I was her only real friend." There was a flush of anger on her lovably plain face as her gray eyes challenged first one and then another of the Forsyte girls. 1 or 2 looked a little ashamed, but there was not a single voice to contradict Lois Dunlap's flat assertion. "Will you please go on, Miss Crane?" Dundee urged, but he had missed nothing of the little byplay. "I wish you would call me Penny, so I'd feel more like a person than a witness," Penny retorted thornily. "Where was I? Oh, yes. Nita cooled right off when Lois reminded her that Polly was always abrupt like that." And here Penny paused to grin apologetically at the girl with the masculine-looking haircut. "And then we all went into the private dining room where Nita had ordered a perfectly gorgeous lunch, with a heavenly centerpiece of green-striped yellow orchids. Well, I don't suppose you're interested in what we ate and things like that." She hesitated. Was there anything unusual in the conversation? Anything like a quarrel? Dundee prompted. Oh, no, Penny protested. Nothing happened out of the ordinary at all. No, wait. Nita received a letter by messenger, or rather a note, when we were about halfway through luncheon. There was a low, strangled-in-the-throat cry from someone. Who had uttered it, Dundee could not be sure, since his eyes had been on his notebook. But what had really interrupted Penny Crane was a crash. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Murder at Bridge. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 4. Pardon, awfully sorry, Clive Hammond muttered, as he bent to pick up the fragments of a coloured pottery ashtray which he and his fiancée, Polly Beale, had been sharing. Don't worry about picking it up, Polly commanded in her brusque voice, but Dundee, listening acutely, was sure of a very slight pause between the two parts of her sentence. He glanced at the couple, the tall, masculine-looking girl lounging deep in an armchair, Clive Hammond, rather unusually good-looking, with his dark red hair, brown eyes, and a face and body as compactly and symmetrically designed as one of the buildings which had been pointed out to Dundee as the product of the young architect's genius, now resuming his seat upon the arm of the chair. His chief concern seemed to be for another ashtray, which Sergeant Turner, with a grin, produced from one of the many little tables with which the room was provided. Rather strange that those two should be engaged, Dundee mused. Go on, Miss Crane, the detective urged, as if he were impatient of the delay. About that note or letter. It was in a blue-grey envelope, with printing or engraving in the upper left-hand corner, Penny went on, half closing her eyes to recapture the scene in its entirety. Like business firms use, she amended. I couldn't help seeing, since I sat so near Nita. She seemed startled, or, well, maybe I'd better say surprised and a little sore, but she tore it open and read it at a glance almost, which is why I say it must have been only a note. But while she was reading it she frowned, then smiled, as if something had amused or... She smiled, like any woman reading a love letter, Caroline Drake interrupted positively. I myself was sure that one of her many admirers had broken an engagement, but had signed himself, "With all my love, darling, your own so-and-so." Dundee wondered if even Caroline Drake's husband, the carefully groomed and dignified John C. Drake, bank vice-president, had ever sent her such a note, but he did not let his pencil slow down, for Penny was talking again. I think you're assuming a little too much, Caroline, but let that pass. At any rate, Nita didn't say a word about the contents of the note, and, naturally, no one asked the question. She simply tucked it into the pocket of her silk summer coat, which was draped over the back of her chair, and the luncheon went on. Then we all drove over here, and found Polly waiting in her own coupe, in the road in front of the house. She told Nita she had rung the bell, but the maid, Lydia, didn't answer, so she had just waited. Nita didn't seem surprised, said she had a key if Lydia hadn't come back yet. You see, she interrupted herself to explain to Dundee, Nita had already told us at luncheon that poor darling Lydia, as she called her, had to go into town to get an abscessed tooth extracted, and was to wait in the dentist's office until she felt equal to driving herself home again in Nita's coupe. Yes, Nita had taken her in herself. She answered the beginning of a question from Dundee. At what time? Dundee queried. I don't know exactly, but Nita said she'd had to dash away at an ungodly hour so that Lydia could make her 10 o'clock dentist's appointment, and that she herself could get a manicure and a shampoo and have her hair dressed, so I imagine she must have left no later than 15 or 20 minutes to 10. How did Mrs. Selim get out to Breakaway Inn, if she left her own car with a maid? you saw her arrive with Lois," Penny reminded him. "Nita had told us all about Lydia's dentist's appointment when she was at my house for dinner Wednesday night," Lois Dunlap contributed. "I offered to call for her anywhere she said, and take her out to Breakaway Inn in my car today. I met her, at her suggestion, in the French hat salon of the shop where she got her shampoo and manicure, Redmond's department store." "A large dinner party, Mrs. Dunlap?" Dundee asked. "Not large at all, just 12 of us, the crowd here, except for Mr. Sprague, Penny and Janet." "Who was Mrs. Selim's dinner partner?" Dundee asked. "That's right, he isn't here," Lois Dunlap corrected herself. "Ralph Hammond brought her and was her dinner partner." "Thank you. Now, Penny, you were saying the maid had not returned." "Oh, but she had," Penny answered impatiently. "If I'm going to be interrupted so much... Well, Nita rang the bell and Lydia came tying on her apron. Nita kissed her on the cheek that wasn't swollen and asked her why she hadn't let Polly in, and Lydia said she hadn't heard the bell because she had dropped asleep in her room in the basement, dopey from the local anesthetic, you know," she explained to Dundee. "I see," Dundee acknowledged, and underlined heavily another note in his scrawled shorthand. "So Lydia took our hats and summer coats and put them in the hall closet, and then followed Nita, who was calling to her, on into Nita's bedroom. We thought she either wanted to give directions about the makings for the cocktails and the sandwiches, or to console poor Lydia for the awful pain she had had at the dentist's, so we didn't intrude. We made a dive for the bridge tables, found our places, and were ready to play when Nita joined us. Nita and Karen... Just a minute, Penny. Did any of you, then or later, until Mrs. Marshall discovered the tragedy, go into Mrs. Selim's bedroom?" "There was no need for us to," Penny told him. "There's a lavatory with the dressing table right behind the staircase. I, for one, didn't go into Nita's room until after Karen screamed." There was a chorus of similar denials on the part of every woman present. At Dundee's significant pressing of the same question upon the men, he was met with either laconic negatives or sharply indignant ones. "All right, Penny. Go ahead, please." "I was going to tell you how we were seated for bridge, if that interests you," Penny said, rather tartly. "It interests me intensely," Dundee assured her, smiling. "Then it was this way," began Penny, thawing instantly. "Karen and Nita, Carolyn and I were at this table," and she pointed to the table nearer the hall. "Flora, Polly, Janet and Lois were at the other. We played at those tables all afternoon. We simply pivoted at our own table after the end of each rubber. When Nita became dummy..." "Forgive me," Dundee begged, as he interrupted her again. "I'd like to ask a question. Mrs. Dunlap, since you were at the other table, perhaps you will tell me what your partner and opponents were doing just before Mrs. Selim became dummy." Lois Dunlap pressed her fingertips into her temples, as if in an effort to remember clearly. "It's rather hard to think of bridge now, Mr. Dundee," she said at last. "But yes, of course I remember. We had finished a rubber and had decided there would be no time for another, since it was so near 5:30. "That last rubber, please, Mrs. Dunlap," Dundee suggested. "Who were partners, and just when was it finished?" "Flora..." Lois turned toward Mrs. Miles, who had sat with her hands tightly locked, and her great haggard dark eyes roving tensely from one to another. "You and I were partners, weren't we?" "Of course. Remember you were dummy and I played the hand? You went out to telephone, didn't you? That's right, I remember clearly now. Flora said she had to telephone the house to ask how her two babies, 6 and 4 years old they are, Mr. Dundee, and the rosiest dumplings. Well, anyway, Flora went to telephone." "In the little foyer between the main hall and Mrs. Selim's room?" "Yes, of course," Lois Dunlap answered, but Dundee's eyes were upon Flora Miles, and he saw her naturally sallow face go yellow under its too thick rouge. "I played the hand and made my bid, although Flora and I had gone down 400 on the hand before," Lois continued, with a rueful twinkle in her pleasant grey eyes. "When the score was totted up, I found I'd won a bit after all. Our winnings go to the Forsyte Alumni Scholarship Fund," she explained. "Yes, I know," Dundee nodded. "And then?" "Polly asked the other table how they stood, and Nita said, 'One game to go on this rubber, provided we make it.' Karen was dealing the cards then, and Nita was looking very happy. She'd been winning pretty steadily, I think." "Pardon, Mrs. Dunlap, how did the players at your table dispose of themselves then? That is, immediately after you had finished playing the last hand, and Mrs. Marshall was dealing at the other table?" Lois screwed up her forehead. "Let me think. I know what I did. I went over to watch the game at the other table and stayed there till Mr. Miles, came in for cocktails. I can't tell you exactly what the other three did." There was a strained silence. Dundee saw Polly Scale's hand tighten convulsively on Clive Hammond's, saw Janet Raymond flush scarlet, watched a muscled jerk in Flora Miles' otherwise rigid face. Suddenly he sprang to his feet. "I am going to make what will seem an absurd request," he said tensely. "I am going to ask you all, the women, I mean, to take your places at the bridge tables. And then," he paused for an instant, his blue eyes hard, "I want to see the death hand played exactly as it was played while Nita Selim was being murdered." End of chapter 4. Recorded by Gesine in September 2007.